What I wanted to say is I just received some news today from some friends of mine at Goldsmiths University. They've sent a delegation to get into Gaza, and they're currently being detained and questioned by the Egyptian Secret Service. Now, what this shows, as well as the fact that when on the 15th of May, the Egyptian people, some of them Palestinian, but many Egyptian people that wanted to march to Gaza to mark the day that Israel was founded in 1948, the great tragedy where over 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from their home. The Egyptian army actually stopped those people from going to Palestine, to Palestinian land. And the reason for this was that the revolution in Egypt is not fully complete yet. One thing that the former regime did well was, I'm not saying anything positive about the regime, but one thing that he did very well, being a military man himself, was basically creating a sort of economy of its own within the military. So therefore, the people within the Egyptian military had certain advantages that normal citizens didn't. And also, Egypt was a state which was fully reliant on US military aid. So ultimately, he who owns the army owns the country. And I think that is something that we are still seeing. We are still seeing they are trying to break free from the shackles of US military domination. Of course, if we're talking about military hardware in the world, the 5 biggest suppliers of military, of course, the United States, Britain, France, Russia, China. And so therefore, you have those governments having a large amount of control in different spheres of the world, different areas, they have different amounts of control. Now, what we want to talk about in terms of Palestine and understanding the plight of the Palestinian people, I don't think we can understand the plight of the Palestinian people without understanding the ideology of Zionism and what Zionism is and what the state of Israel is. Zionism was an ideology which is not actually that different from many other colonial ideologies. The tactics that the Zionists have used and are using today are not that different from the tactics that Captain Cook used when he arrived in the land we now call Australia, which was formerly 500 nations. He arrived with a British flag, stuck it in the ground. The colonialism is part of the same family, and I think that's something that we must always be absolutely clear about. That in terms of Israel, we are talking about a colonial settler entity. And that is important to understand, so everybody can understand that. So people that oppose colonialism anywhere else in the world can say, okay, I recognize that colonialism. But in terms of Theodor Herzl, in 1896, he wrote a book called The Judenstaat, which means the Jewish state. But who was Theodor Herzl? Theodor Herzl was a Hungarian man. He didn't write this book sitting in what we now call Tel Aviv. He wrote this book in Europe. And it's also important that we understand what Zionism was back then and what it is. Many of the early Zionists would call themselves socialists. Many of them were irreligious. This is important for us to be honest and absolutely clear about what took place then. What was Palestine? What was the status of Palestine in 1896? Well, it was under the control of the Turkish. It was under the control of the Turkish, as was what we now call Iraq. So, the Zionist movement at that time wanting, there's a big lie, basically, that Zionism is about self-determination and is about a homeland for people without a homeland. A land without people for a people without a land. This is a big, big lie that ultimately is based on the displacement of the indigenous people. That's what it's about. It's about displacement of indigenous people. And so at this point, the Zionist movement tried to get some type of relationship with the Ottoman rulers of the land and start buying small pieces of land in Palestine, small settlements and stuff like that. They weren't actually very successful at all at that stage, but there were some settlements being built, and there was a movement of people from Europe to the land of Palestine. But then I think the big moment that came, and then Jody referenced it earlier, came in 1917, which was when Arthur Balfour, the foreign minister of this country, wrote a letter to a man, a banker, called Rothschild in the United States, which is now known as the Balfour Declaration. Now, this declaration said, we view with favor the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. But what was the status of Palestine at the time? It was still ruled by the Turks. The British actually, at that time, were involved in the First World War, and the reason that the Balfour Declaration was written was to get the US army involved on the British side, and the Turkish were on the opposing side. But the British not only managed to get the US army involved in the First World War on their side through the Balfour Declaration, they managed to get many of the indigenous people on their side through a man called Thomas Edward Lawrence. Now, many of you will have heard the name Lawrence of Arabia. Now, people have different perspectives on this man. Some say he was this great Arabist. He was this person that was fighting for Arab rights. This is ridiculous, and this is a complete distortion and twisting of history. He was somebody who was there to get the indigenous people of the land to agree to fight with the British, on the side of the British, and later the United States, against their Turkish rulers in order to split up the land. Now, so a form of nationalism was promoted, and so people were thinking, if we fight with the British, on the side of the British, we will be given independence. As if anybody can give you independence, much less the British. So this is what happened. You had the interest of Zionism and the interest of Arab nationalism at the time on the same, in a strange way, on the same side, but working with different futures in mind. So you had basically the British double-crossing, but it wasn't clear at that point who they were necessarily double-crossing. I think it's very unlikely that they would double-cross the US Army with the power of the US Army, because that's what the Balfour Declaration was about. It was about getting the US Army involved in the First World War. And we have to think to ourselves, if in 1917 the Zionist lobby had such power in the United States that it could send a US army to war, what type of power does this lobby have today? What type of power does this lobby have in 2011? If in 1917 it had the power to turn a US army, what power does this lobby have today? So that was in 1917. Another important date, which I'm sure many people in the room are probably aware of this, but if you don't know, please research two words, the Havara Agreement. In 1933, this was an agreement between the Zionist movement and the Nazi government in Germany. 1933. What was this agreement? What did this agreement say? It said that the German government would move 50,000 German Jewish people and send them where? Where do you think they said they'd send them? In 1933. Bear in mind that at this time, the land of Palestine was called the British Mandate of Palestine. So after the First World War, when the British succeeded with the help of many of the indigenous people of the land to win, they split the land up. The British Mandate of Mesopotamia is what we now call Iraq. The British Mandate of Palestine, Sykes-Picot, the British and the French basically split up the land amongst themselves, divided amongst themselves. But when, in 1933, the land was called the British Mandate of Palestine. It wasn't called the British Mandate of Israel. It's called the British Mandate of Palestine. At this stage, in 1933, an agreement was signed between the Nazi government and the Zionist movement in the United States to move 50,000 German Jewish people and place them in Palestine. Now, this really leads us directly on to my next point, was that whenever somebody comes out and says they are an anti-Zionist, wherever they're from, I have a good friend of mine who lost family in the Holocaust